Uh, Right now, we're going to hear from Dr. Jody McBrien of USF School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, who has taught courses on international human rights, global migration, and globalization. The author of over 50 articles, book chapters, and books, she has worked with migrants and refugees in a number of countries and has told their stories. Jody will present the medical impacts of climate-driven migration.
Actually, I won't present the medical. I'm a social scientist, I'm certainly not a medical doctor, and you've heard some wonderful professional opinions about what's happening in terms of physical health and mental health. But as I said, I'm a social scientist. I'm more an international migration specialist. And so what I'm going to be doing is looking at the intersection of climate change, health, and global migration. And my thanks to Bob for inviting me to speak at this important conference, and I've learned so much from the other speakers. So obviously, as we've heard many times, climate change is affecting people locally and internationally, not only in terms of health, but also with respect to their occupations and economics. Increasingly severe climate conditions are connected to health issues that cause people to migrate. And once they do, they're also met with a new set of physical and mental health challenges. My work has increasingly made me aware of international migration due to climate change. So much reporting and research on migration has recently focused on global warming. And I'm also a human rights professor and activist, and I think that'll probably become obvious in some of my remarks. As is so often the case, this issue hits people who are not wealthy and who depend on weather patterns for sustenance and their livelihood, primarily through agriculture, fishing, and construction work. They're also most affected by pollution caused by the high-income countries, the United States, China, and the European Union countries in particular. Research suggests that more than 216 million people, I forgot this thing, didn't I? Hold on a second. Yep, there we go. More than 216 million people could be internally displaced due to climate change by 2050. This means within your own country. And these numbers can be kind of hard to visualize, so I like to give some perspective. This would be equivalent to 10 Floridas. And Florida is the third most populous of the US states. External migration figures due to climate, moving to another country, are not readily available, but indications are that they're increasing and complicated by factors of economics and health. The World Economic Forum finds that climate change is costing the world $16 million every hour. As you know, we're no longer just talking about developing nations. I took this photo on the slide in my backyard in August after Hurricane Debbie dumped torrential rains. My husband has lived in that house for 25 years and had never seen anything like it. We were fortunate. Our house wasn't flooded, just our roads. The new development behind our house did not fare as well, and many, many people lost all of their possessions. Yeah, that's fine. My husband and I are actually international migrants. We're moving full-time in next year to Paris, France. In part, it's due to climate change. Not completely, but that is certainly one reason. I can't take the summer heat. I can't. And I'm also kind of tired of the impact of the hurricanes, not only on my family's personal property, but also on my work, my students, and my friends. Our decision makes me aware of how difficult it is to migrate to a new country. And frankly, we're people with privilege. Migrants with low to no incomes trying to escape devastation to their homelands due to climate change have little recourse is they cannot be politically defined as a refugee or an asylum seeker. And my expertise has been in research on refugees and asylum seekers for over 20 years. Now, normally I'd be in France at this time. So I decided to begin with a useful tale from one of the world's most beloved books from France, with translations and sales second only to the Bible, and that is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince. Most people have read it once. I love it so much that I read it almost annually and have since I was 16, so that's quite a long time. One of the tales is especially fitting for this conference. The little prince asks the pilot to draw him a sheep to help manage the baobab seedlings on his tiny planet. His planet is infested with the baobab's seeds, and they can become stunningly large. One measured by the Guinness Book of World Records weighed 54 tons just in its above-ground mass. Daily, the little prince went around the planet to scour for baobab seedlings and uproot them, keeping the environment of his planet healthy. It's a matter of discipline, he said. The work was tedious, but easy enough when the trees were seedlings. However, he noted, it could be catastrophic if unattended. You know where I'm going with this. We've ignored climate change for too long, and our baobabs are no longer seedlings. I won't go into the political and industrial reasons that have landed us in this predicament. In a way, they're a moot point. What we must do now is find a way to go forward. We are overdue to root out the baobabs. Though my primary topic is the intersection of health, climate change, and migration, I want to give a very brief background about how we arrived here. We've ignored warnings about practices by individuals, corporations, and governments that have increased the problems for decades. And we're now at a place where we can't ignore the effects. This year, our region suffered the effects of 3 hurricanes. In July, Debbie totaled over $100 million in damage just in Sarasota. And I watched boats go down my street for 3 days. Helene caused power outages for over 2 million people, death, and terrible housing destruction. And then Milton, which caused evacuations and outages for over a week for many, and millions more dollars in destruction. Additionally, the health implications from mold, bacteria from sewage, and toxic debris mixed in the floodwaters is incalculable. And then there are the mental health issues of anxiety, stress, fear, and depression that we've learned about this morning. Many people have chosen to leave places like Florida and Louisiana out of fear, exhaustion, and total loss of their homes and possessions. Early public information began at least 70 years ago when research indicated the problem with fossil fuel expansion. In the 80s, warming along with environmental disasters such as wildfires and droughts became more pronounced. However, support for international climate accords in the United States has been inconsistent. Given the clear statistics about health impacts, lives lost, and millions of dollars lost due to climate change, it seems clear that it is time to depoliticize the topic and listen to scientists who overwhelmingly agree that we must act now to slow the climate crisis. As you probably know, China and the US are the top 2 contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is an illustration from the United Nations. The countries most affected by climate change are relatively poor, such as South Sudan, Madagascar, Somalia, and Chad. They experience the droughts, floods, hurricanes, and wildfires, and have very low economies. And closer to home, the climate change is affecting us on the Gulf Coast. Bob mentioned insurance is a real problem for many. The Energy Collective Group stated that increasing insurance costs are pricing many homeowners out of the market, with premiums up as much as 400% in certain areas over the past 5 years. To state the obvious, insurance costs are predicted to become steeper following this hurricane season, which is not even over yet. And so more internal migration is likely to follow. There are many reasons for international migration. Climate migration is a relatively new one among the reasons people decide to leave their homelands. So here's a little background on major driving forces. Economics is one. Think about it. If the land is devastated and you can't feed your family, you can't get a job to earn enough money to put a roof over your head, you will probably try to find a place where you can do that, legally or not. Social issues are another, for any number of reasons. You don't fit in, or you're discriminated against. I work with a lot of LGBTQ immigrants who face this issue. Politics and unstable governments are the other issue I've worked with for a couple of decades, creating situations of refugees and asylum seekers. And then there's environmental change. Many human rights scholars, myself included, have argued that the UN should revisit the definition of refugees to include climate for a reason. Very unlikely that it will happen. The UN definition of a refugee was created in the aftermath of World War II, and it includes 5 specific cases only. It's a person with a well-founded fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or a particular political opinion. That's it. The 1951 Convention and 67 Protocol don't include provisions for people who are forced to move due to climate that destroys their home, health, or livelihood. And the UNHCR is not interested in changing the definition. In brief, the Convention and Protocol requires intentional actions that affect individuals. The definition is political. Floods, droughts, and fire are not intentional. And so people from poor countries, often most affected by climate change, do not tend to have the kind of financial portfolio required to legally migrate to healthier countries, as I do. And they don't have the international treaties that protect them. An added factor is that many fleeing severe climate also come from politically unstable countries, like Sudan, Iraq, and Iran. Climate-safer countries fear accepting them for security reasons. Now, this doesn't mean that the UNHCR is unaware of the problem. Just this week, they released figures stating that 75% of the world's displaced people live in countries heavily affected by climate hazards. The report shows that extremely fragile states received around $2 per person in annual adaptation funding, compared to $161 per person in non-fragile states like ours. This is a massive injustice. The public is largely unaware of just how significant climate migration is. It's more than double the number of UN-defined refugees. 114 million people in 2024 have been displaced by climate, according to the UN. To date this year, and I believe Bob already mentioned this, there are 44 million, got ahead of myself. In comparison with the number of UN refugees this year, that number is 43.4 million, so less than half. Internal displacement, forced movement within one's country, affected people in 82 countries and territories due to weather and geophysical events in 2022. This was where Bob has already mentioned this. In the same year, 3.2 million US adults were displaced by natural disasters, and 500,000 have not been able to return to their homes. Climate migration and natural disasters are expected to surge in coming decades, with forecasts predicting 1.2 billion people could be displaced globally by 2050. So let's look at some of the places affected. Papua New Guinea, one of the most hazard-prone countries in the world, is subject to numerous geohazards. The Asian Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development describes the women of the Carteret Islands in the country as among the first environmental refugees. These atolls are quickly becoming completely underwater. Sea level rise forced the people into resettlement camps, and there they remain plagued by extreme effects of climate. When small food gardens are flooded, they fall into even more poverty and hunger. This causes their children to be absent from school as they scavenge for food. Many areas throughout the world have been affected by wildfires due to climate change, and this is a photo from Evia Island near Athens. I worked there as a volunteer at a refugee camp a few years back. The fire causes loss of lives and property and creates health issues due to smoke inhalation. And of course, loss of property results in more migration. We heard about this earlier today, the torrential rains in Spain this past October, creating the deadliest floods there since 1967. Hundreds have died, and the results include a lack of safe drinking water, which can lead to cholera, diarrhea, typhoid, hepatitis A, and other infectious diseases. And of course, residents have to leave their homes. I don't know if you can see that very well. Last week, I attended the International Paris Photo Exhibition. This photo was included. It was taken in Jordan, the second most water-scarce country in the world. The photo is of rural Syrian families seriously impacted by climate change. They're forced to move several times a year to find agricultural work wherever there's been sufficient rainfall for crops to grow. Dehydration, as we heard yesterday, causes body temperature rise, heart rate rise, and elevated blood pressure. And extreme dehydration causes weakness, confusion, brain damage, and death. Major health problem related to climate change is malnutrition. When changing climate makes the land untenable, crops become insufficient. Additionally, as we heard yesterday, vector-borne diseases increase. Water concerns related both to dehydration and malnutrition in drought areas, and waterborne diseases where areas are flooded, polluted, and too poor to make necessary changes. I so clearly recall visiting a village in Uganda in which I witnessed young children filling their water bottles in the lake that was inhabited by a large number of hippopotamuses. It sickened me to think of the health hazards they faced by drinking water that included excrement from these animals. The crisis of COVID-19 and its restrictions on migration highlighted the need to prioritize international health-related issues. The International Organization for Migration states that persons displaced by environmental disasters are significantly more vulnerable to health impacts of pandemics. Their ability to flee can be impeded by these environmental disasters. During the height of the COVID pandemic, my work at the OECD alerted me to numerous migrant health-related issues, particularly for refugees. These included a lack of health care and vaccines for this population, living in overcrowded spaces, which increased the spread of COVID, and misinformation about COVID and vaccines. Once people migrate, it's critical that they be able to avail themselves of public health services in their country of refuge. In some countries, citizens and officials rally against providing services for immigrants. Other countries, such as New Zealand and France, recognize that providing health care to all also ensures their country's citizens are less susceptible to health issues that the migrants might bring. And so in the long run, caring for migrants is also caring for one's own citizens. Issues that we might not even think as related to climate change affect the health of millions of people worldwide. I cut a little bit because we heard some of these yesterday. The EPA, though, states that people who must spend hours outdoors and are therefore exposed to extreme heat are more likely to experience dehydration and skin cancer. Children are more susceptible to air pollutants and water contaminants. Children also suffer more mental health impacts from experiencing extreme environmental impacts and moves due to climate change. Changing schools and adjusting to new languages and cultures is mentally and socially challenging. Migration to new countries complicates these issues as families have difficulty navigating new systems for healthcare due to language and bureaucratic challenges. Impacts to the environment disrupt food production, with the result that distribution can be limited and the costs increase. Reduced access to healthy food increases chances for disease and malnutrition. And then, of course, there are the deaths related to climate change. Sengupta reported on deaths in the US, Mexico, India, Mali, and Greece this past summer due to extreme heat. According to the World Meteorological Organization, extreme heat killed about 500,000 people this year. Extreme heat exacerbates the health issues. Take, for instance, the case of 75-year-old immigrant Jose Delgado, who's pictured here, who currently picks our vegetables in Homestead, Florida. He has suffered from 2 heat strokes that have damaged his kidneys. His doctor told him that his heart is unlikely to survive a 3rd heat stroke. Mr. Delgado has campaigned with an advocacy group for a local law that would require employers to provide water, rest, and shade breaks for Miami-Dade County's more than 60,000 agriculture and construction workers on excessively hot days. According to the New York Times, the law was opposed by industries and government officials that said that such rules would create an unneeded burden to thousands of businesses. And so, due to increasingly high temperatures from climate change, we place underpaid workers who provide our food in unnecessary pain, suffering, and hazard to their health and their lives. All these factors create an increased chance of mental health effects such as anxiety, depression, sleep issues, and trauma. Climate change is already affecting the mental health of today's children who will have to deal with the effects of global warming. Not only will they deal with the physical repercussions of hotter temperatures, increased severe weather, and melting ice caps. As many as 1/3 of adolescents are currently struggling with what the US National Institute of Health has labeled eco-anxiety. And a worldwide survey found that 67% of teenagers are worried about climate change, with 37% saying that it affects their daily lives. So, what do we do? As I stated, the so-called climate refugees have no legal access to migration through a refugee designation. So to migrate legally to most industrialized countries, frankly, they'd have to be like me, migrating to France, being able to prove that they have significant income and would not, therefore, require support from the nation. This is a complex issue, and not really the topic of the talk, so I won't get into it except to say that research increasingly shows that many developed countries actually need immigrants to fill jobs due to low birth rates. So I can't, helping climate migrants could be a win for both individuals and countries. I can't help but think how amazing it would be for the United States and other highly polluting countries to embrace migration from those countries suffering most from the effects of climate change. Countries such as the US, China, India, and the EU are responsible for much of the reason that people must migrate for health and other climate-affected reasons. So it's time for countries to stop putting up all these barriers and start to work together instead, acknowledging our parts in climate change and working to help those most affected who must move to save their families and themselves. Rather than relying on hearsay and disinformation, it's important for the public to seek out the research of scientists and social scientists to reduce the potential for unfairly judging people who are forced to migrate, even though they may not have the resources to do so independently. Doing our part. Did you know that cheap synthetic fashion is one of the major pollutants responsible for as much as 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions? The fabric is non-biodegradable, made from plastic. In the US alone, the average consumer throws out over 80 pounds of clothes every year. A large proportion of unbought cheap fashion is burned, resulting in air pollution. Washing synthetic clothes releases microplastics into the waterways, harming aquatic life, affecting health, and adding to the world's plastic waste problem. Natural fabrics, while initially more expensive, last longer, and are non-polluting. Consumerism, overbuying, overconsumption of stuff costs our Earth. Across its life cycle, the average product results in a carbon emission of 6.3 times its own weight, according to a study done at the Earth Institute's research program on sustainability policy and management. Next week, Netflix will show the documentary Buy Now, The Shopping Conspiracy, that analyzes the ever more clever ways in which advertisers get us to buy stuff we don't need, and the impact it will have on our environment. Look familiar? I hate these things. It takes 12 million barrels of oil to make the 30 million plastic bags used by Americans every year. It's such a simple way to support the environment. Use Canvas. So that, voting with a conscience, learning more about migrants. For starters, did you know that the Nigerian refugee Philip Agarwali created computational formulas that led to the creation of the internet? He won over 100 prizes for his discovery. Google's co-creator, Sergey Brin, was a refugee from Russia who fled anti-Semitism with his family. Another household name that we've seen here, Albert Einstein. In 2023, a study found that immigrants to the US produced 23% of the total innovation output of new inventions. So from major discoveries to important daily contributions, migrants have shown themselves to be resilient people who, when welcomed, are grateful to have a place to live safe lives and raise their families in peace. 2 more paragraphs. Right now, the UN Annual Climate Change Conference, COP29, is taking place. Its theme is on financial responsibility for climate change. This includes financial support for those who are forced from their livelihoods and homes due to extreme weather. Notably, the top leaders of the United States, China, and the European Union are not in attendance. US citizens who are among those who are physically, psychologically, and financially devastated due to climate change. Their economic situations range from well-off to poor. Many areas in the world suffering from extreme climate house people living on $1 or $2 a day. These are not people plotting to take advantage of Americans. They want to survive. They want to raise their children and family. They want to work to provide for their families. This conference is dedicated to educating people so that they can go out and educate others. Our country is so misinformed about refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants. As a global community, we're all in this together. Those looking for refuge are typically not responsible for what brought them to seek safety. This is a time for understanding and compassion, not for demonizing people. Thank you.